Welcome to this evening's lecture by Professor Adele Reinhardt. It is entitled Holy Hollywood, What Movies Teach Us About the Bible. And what a fascinating title that is, and we're very excited about this presentation. But before I introduce Professor Reinhartz and later on Professor Walsh, I'd like to say something about the sponsor of tonight's presentation, the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies. My name is John Brent, and I'm the president of the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies. The Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies, or MCECS, is a nonprofit foundation which, among other things, sponsors events like this virtual event, and also on-campus events and events elsewhere. Indulge me with an anecdote as a bit of background. In 2017, before the pandemic, the House of European History opened in Brussels. This museum expertly covers many intellectual, religious, and political influences on European history and culture. But since its opening, several commentators have reported that the museum fails to mark the importance of Christianity to European history. The museum opening is another example of how the profound influence of early Christianity on Western civilization is increasingly being ignored, and this is even true, of course, in the U.S. At the same time, there's been I might say, a welcome rise in Judaic and Islamic study centers and universities around the world and in the U.S., particularly in large U.S. public and private research universities. And we can count the University of Michigan as part of this trend, with the Islamic Studies program and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies and their influence on campus intellectual life and growing international visibility. However, the teaching of subjects related to early Christianity and Second Temple Judaism is not as prominent. This is resulting in somewhat unfortunate circumstances or consequences for Western culture and U.S. culture in particular. There are now generations of university graduates who are completely unfamiliar with the contributions of early Christianity to Western and U.S. culture. The mission of MCECS is to, therefore, promote early Christian studies as one of the major foundations of Western culture with Islam and Judaism. We believe that promoting such studies will help to address this contemporary historical blindness to the importance of Christianity to how our culture got to where it is today. We do three things at MCECS. Number one, we sponsor events such as this evening's, and we support the work of a Michigan-based international seminar for the study of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, the Enoch Seminar, one of our co-sponsors for tonight's talk. And number three, we raise funds to support fellowships, professorships, and eventually an endowed center at the University of Michigan for the study of early Christianity. We hope that you will consider joining our effort by supporting through us such activities as this one. As I stated above, the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We welcome and rely on money donations to sustain our efforts. We invite you to visit our website at www.mcecs.org, where you can learn more about us and make a donation if you're so moved to do so. Now, on behalf of the MCECS Board of Directors and the Enoch Seminar, I present our presenter, Professor Reinhardt. The second individual that's going to be part of this is Dr. Richard Walsh, and I'll talk about him after I talk about Professor Reinhartz. Professor Reinhartz is an internationally recognized Canadian academic and specialist in the history and literature of Christianity and Judaism in the Greco-Roman period, the Gospel of John, early Jewish-Christian relations, and the impact of the Bible on popular cinema and television, relevant to tonight. Professor Reinhartz received her Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from the University of Toronto in 1975, a Master of Arts degree in 1983, and her PhD in Religious Studies from McMaster University. She is currently a professor of religion at Ottawa University. Professor Richard Walsh, who's going to be our respondent, is a professor of religion, and he's co-director of the honors program at Methodist University in Fayetteville, North Carolina. His primary scholarly areas include theories of interpretation, the Gospel of Mark, and reception criticism of the Gospels. In addition to authoring various articles, his published books include, for our purposes, Mapping the Myths of Biblical Interpretation, Reading the Gospels in the Dark, Finding St. Paul in Film. He also co-wrote with Jeffrey L. Staley, Jesus, the Gospels, and Cinematic Imagination, a handbook. He is the editor of Screening Scripture with George Ashley, Son of Man, an African Jesus film with Jeffrey L. Staley and Professor Reinhartz, and has been asked to edit a Bible and film handbook for Bloomsbury. Dr. Walsh was named Methodist University's first Womack Endowed Professor of Religion and Philosophy in August of 2017. We welcome you both, and Professor Reinhardt, we would love to hear your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen, make sure that, here we go. Okay, so my talk, as you can see here, is called Holy Hollywood, What the Movies Teach Us About the Bible. For the past century and more, movies have competed with books for the attention and leisure time of many North Americans. And at the same time, the movie industry depends greatly on books of all kinds from all eras. Indeed, about 50% of the Hollywood movies made in any given year are book adaptations. As we can see here, this is just a selection of movies based on books. It should therefore be no surprise that the best-selling book of all time, the Bible, should also be the book most frequently adapted for the movies. Since the birth of cinema in the late 19th century, the books that comprise the Christian Bible, that is, the books commonly known as the Old Testament and the New Testament, have been adapted hundreds of times and in numerous genres and all over the world. These genres from animation to zombie movies. There's a quote often attributed to Walt Disney, one of the most famous filmmakers of all time. And here it is. I would rather entertain and hope that people learned something than educate people and hope that they were entertained. Now, whether he actually said this, I do not know. What I do know is that most directors and producers who make Bible movies are entertainers first and educators only second. The question I'm asking this evening is as follows. What are we as movie audiences learning about the Bible while we are being entertained by Bible movies? The question arises both because of the status of the Bible in Western culture, the tendency of many people to believe that the Bible is a book of history, as well as the claims that many Bible movies make to be historically accurate retellings. And here's one example. This is the opening scrolling text of the 1951 movie David and Bathsheba. So this scrolling text informs us of the time period, 3,000 years ago, the political context, when David was king over the United Tribes of Israel, and the biblical source, the second book of Samuel. The scrolling text continues to describe the situation, the war between the kingdoms of Israel and Ammon, an important character, Joab, the commander of the Israelite army, and the location, Rabbah, the Ammonite stronghold. This opening text is accompanied by military-style music. And so the text and music together provide a commentary on the opening scene, which depicts the armies of King David gathering to fight the Ammonites. Movies based on the Gospels are even more insistent on their historicity. And here, for example, are the opening frames of Cecil B. DeMille's 1927 movie, The King of Kings. So it's very pious and claims to be historically true. But this introduction is followed by a delightfully raunchy scene featuring Mary Magdalene as a wealthy courtesan. This is one of my favorite scenes in all of the Bible movies put together. Oops. Sorry. Let's go again. Okay, so here we see in Judea, this is what happens right after the introduction we just saw. Groaning under the iron heel of Rome, the beautiful courtesan Mary of Magdala laughed alike at God and man. So this is a 10-minute scene, which I would love to show you, but I'm not going to. In this scene, Mary fumes with rage at her lover. You'll never guess who her lover is. Judas. Judas has abandoned her in order to follow a lowly carpenter from Nazareth. She rides off in her zebra-drawn chariot to reclaim Judas, only to fall under the spell of Jesus herself. He exorcises her demons, and she takes on a new and modestly dressed persona as she realizes the error of her ways. So here we have the before and after picture, before the exorcism and afterwards, having to do with her clothing, of course. Now, there is not a shred of evidence in the Bible or anywhere else for this depiction of Mary Magdalene. It is entirely a figment of DeMille's prodigious imagination. So much then for historicity. It may be too much to expect Bible movies to teach us about the Bible, if by that we mean the content of the Bible. The very act of adapting a literary text to the medium of cinema requires making decisions about casting, costuming, setting, and so on, about which the Bible is almost entirely silent. Adaptation also involves filling in the many gaps in the biblical source material, such as the child and teenage years of biblical figures such as Moses and Jesus. It is inevitable that a Bible movie designed to entertain will stray far from its biblical source in the quest for narrative continuity and box office success. For this reason, viewers whose sole knowledge of the Bible comes from film will pick up some rather interesting so-called facts. Take, for example, the best-known biblical epic of all time, Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 rendition of the Ten Commandments. In the film's preamble, DeMille insists that he has supplemented the meager details of the biblical story from historical sources such as Philo and Josephus, who he suggests may have read the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let's take a look at this. Whoops, sorry. Let's get it over here. Here we go.
The Holy Bible omits some 30 years of Moses' life. From the time he was a 3-month-old baby and was found in the bulrushes by Bethuel, the daughter of Pharaoh, and adopted into the court of Egypt, until he learned that he was Hebrew and killed the Egyptian. To fill in those missing years, we turn to ancient historians such as Philo and Josephus. Philo wrote at the time that Jesus of Nazareth walked the earth, and Josephus wrote some 50 years later and watched the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. These historians had access to documents long since destroyed, or perhaps lost, like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yet from this film, we learn many things that even Philo and Josephus did not know. We learn that Moses was loved and respected by his grandfather, the Pharaoh Seti, that he had a close relationship with his adoptive brother Ramses, despite their rivalry for the love of the same woman, the beautiful Nefertiri, and that that Moses' Egyptian mother had met his Hebrew mother, and finally that Moses had abandoned his wife Sephora in his single-minded pursuit of freedom for his people. And most startling of all, we learn that Moses was a proto-Jesus. We see that here, a redeemer preordained to free his people from bondage. Indeed, according to the film's unseen narrator, He was given by God to his parents for that very purpose. The narrator is actually DeMille himself. Unlike Jesus, Moses was conceived and born in the usual manner. Nevertheless, it was God who cast his seed into this particular family as the instrument of God's salvific purpose. Finally, we also see that Moses represents an ideal America as a bastion of freedom for all, as in this final shot in which Moses poses as the Statue of Liberty. And you can see that in the slide. From other Bible films, we learn that Bathsheba, Ruth, and the Queen of Sheba were all nearly stoned to death for adultery and or idolatry, to be saved only at the last moment by their brave and handsome lovers, David, Boaz, and the King Solomon, respectively. We also learn that King David lost his faith and became an atheist, but Bathsheba showed him the error of his ways and steered him back to the right path. Solomon, for his part, fathered a son with the Queen of Sheba. The son became the first king of Sheba, a development that was apparently much welcomed after centuries of matriarchy. From the recent Noah movie, we learn that Noah believed that God wanted him to save all the animals except for people. And to this end, he was prepared to kill his own newborn grandchildren. Thankfully, the women, his wife and his daughter-in-law, along with the watchers known from the books of Enoch, set him straight, but it was a close call. So to sum up, Bible movies hardly provide a good education when it comes to the content of the Bible. This does not mean, however, that we don't learn anything about the Bible by watching Bible movies. Bible movies draw our attention to the many gaps in biblical stories. They fill these gaps from a wide variety of sources, from ancient texts to Renaissance art, medieval and modern literature and drama, and most important, the filmmaker's own imaginations. One can hardly give credit, for example, to the way in which the 1960 film, The Story of Ruth, depicts Ruth's Moabite past as a Moabite priestess, whose job it was to prepare unblemished young girls for the honor of being sacrificed to the Moabite gods. Nor can one take the role of the watchers, and you can see here, in Aronofsky's 2014 movie about Noah, as helpful information about the biblical flood story. Nevertheless, these movies do address questions that might not occur to the casual reader of the biblical stories. Of course, the biblical Ruth had a life before marrying into Naomi's family. And while Aronofsky provides Noah with a far more abrasive personality than one might guess, he also resolves an issue that the Bible leaves unanswered. What exactly did humankind do that warranted such an extreme action on the part of God? Genesis 6:5 says only that, quote, the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually, but we don't know exactly what that evil was. The Noah film provides an answer that resonates well with all of us in the 21st century. The evil was the destruction of the natural environment. Now, whether climate change was on the minds of the biblical storytellers, we cannot know. But the film does draw our attention to the theme of stewardship that one can read into or out of God's instruction to the primordial human beings to take control, to master, or perhaps better, to take responsible care of the earth and the planet and the animals that live and depend on it. The film, the Noah film, also draws attention to the question of theodicy or divine justice. Is it conceivable that every single human being, aside from Noah and family, was wicked enough to deserve death? And what about the conviction of Russell Crowe's Noah that all humankind must die in order for the planet to thrive? Even if humankind is responsible for the climate crisis, should the human race be eradicated? These are all questions that arise and I think can be fruitfully thought about in conjunction with the flood story. Still, one does not need to watch these films to ask these questions or to reflect on the uncertainties in the relationship between humankind and the natural world. In that sense, these Bible movies do not provide unique insights that are unavailable from Jewish and Christian commentaries. Nevertheless, given that many, perhaps most filmgoers, will never engage in close study of the biblical text, these films do provide a way into some of the fundamental questions that biblical narratives also raise. But Bible movies can also project negative and highly problematic messages. Like other Hollywood movies throughout the history of cinema, Bible movies feature white actors as the heroes and heroines. This is something that Hollywood is only now starting to come to grips with. So here we see, oops, oh, not again. Hang on. There we go. So here we see the heroes. Black and other non-white figures may appear here and there in the cast of thousands that were typical of the epics of the 1950s and 60s. Or they may have roles as servants or slaves. That's what we often find especially in the biblical epics. The casting in Bible movies belies the claims to authenticity that many films make, given that the films are set in ancient Israel and surroundings, and these Israel and its surroundings were populated at that time by people of color. A second disheartening convention, evident in many movies, involves coding one or more bad guys as gay. Here's one example. This is Baka, one of the Egyptian overseers. Here we see him right here. He's on the left. One of the Egyptian overseers in the 1956 Ten Commandments movie. When he and Moses see an elderly slave nearly crushed under a stone monument, Moses immediately reaches to cut the woman free. And while as Richard Lindsay wrote, Baka, quote, prissily pulls a silken handkerchief from a leather purse he is wearing and wipes his hands before handing it to Moses. Moses wipes his hands and arms before tossing the handkerchief back to Baka, who doesn't catch it. So there's all kinds of stereotyping that takes place here. Another example is the Egyptian viceroy in Ridley Scott's movie Exodus, Gods and Kings. There he is, who Moses visits and antagonizes when he's still a prince in Seti's kingdom. Ridley Scott's movie of Exodus was done in 2014. One might have hoped that a film released in 2014 would no longer be stereotyping gay characters and coding homosexuality as evil, but such optimism is clearly unwarranted. The Bible epics also convey specific messages about women. The epics of the 50s and 60s were made in the aftermath of World War II, as America welcomed back her soldiers and the American household embraced the wives and mothers who returned from the factories. Both men and women resumed their prescribed pre-war roles, men as breadwinners and women as wives, mothers, and homemakers. But women did not quickly forget the autonomy, the sense of purpose, and the financial independence that came with working outside the home and with contributing economically to the war effort and to the support of their own households. These social changes provided the immediate context for the portrayal of gender and male-female relationships in Bible films of the post-war era. At the same time, the hierarchical relationships between handsome, protective, and dominant men and their beautiful, delicate, and submissive women are subtly infused with other messages: female rebellion against oppression, strength in the face of injustice, and morality and common sense in the face of their men's emotion, ego, and testosterone-driven impulses and behaviors. As a result, Bible films simultaneously elevate and debase their female protagonists. David's Bathsheba is a self-assured woman who knows exactly what she's doing when she bathes on her rooftop within sight of the palace. Married to a cold and undemonstrative soldier, Uriah, she has long been interested in David. She's dynamic, insightful, and persuasive. And she also serves as the moral core of the film, despite the dubious ethics involving the death of her husband and her affair with David. Both of these acts are somehow justified by the love between the amorous couple. And yet, all is not well. She's threatened with stoning, as I've already mentioned before, and things don't resolve for her until she is safely under the protection of her husband, David. A similar portrait can be found in the 1959 epic Solomon and Sheba, in which Sheba, the feisty and seductive queen, falls in love with Solomon, persuades him to attend an orgy in honor of a pagan god, and then she also needs him to save her from the crowds who are going to stone her for idolatry and adultery. In the Jesus movies, the same dynamic can be observed with respect to the portrayal of Mary Magdalene. This is true even in Scorsese's scandalous film, The Last Temptation, in which Mary, hurt by years of rejection, mocks and challenges Jesus, only to then follow him around demurely along with the rest of the disciples. So here we see a similar transformation as we saw in the 1927 DeMille movie, from scantily dressed seductress to a demurely dressed follower of Jesus. More recent Bible movies try to do better in some of these respects, or at least their directors claim they do. Nevertheless, Aronofsky's Noah movie maintains an all-white cast. Noah's wife and daughter-in-law are strong characters who nevertheless are under Noah's control. An exception, perhaps, is the protagonist of Garth Davis's 2018 movie called Mary Magdalene. Here she is. And she's portrayed as something as close to an equal partner to Jesus, and not, as in Scorsese's Last Temptation, as a potential sexual partner. Finally, Bible films as a genre teach that the entire corpus of biblical books from Genesis to Revelation is a Christian book. Whereas one might expect movies based on the books of Genesis, Exodus, Samuel, Ruth, or Esther to hint at the role of these books in the Jewish scriptural canon, for the most part, even these movies are overtly Christian, and in some cases, they're also subtly anti-Jewish. Ruth and Naomi's story is overseen by an old man who prophesies the coming of Christ. Ben-Hur's Jewish hero is unhappy until he follows his sweetheart and becomes a believer in Christ. The King David's advisors, including Nathan, are portrayed and described explicitly as legalistic and narrow-minded, as per the standard anti-Semitic stereotyping that is so pervasive as to pass almost unnoticed, but it is also absorbed unconsciously by viewers of these films. All in all, Bible films support a conservative Christian worldview with respect to gender, race, and sexuality. And they serve the interests of groups within American society that argue that this worldview is biblical. I haven't done a scientific survey, but I would speculate that at least some of the people who enjoy Bible movies already share this same worldview. Those who do not may well stay away from such films altogether, unless, like me, they find some interest and satisfaction in studying them. While the Bible may not teach us anything new about biblical characters, stories, the ancient Near East, or even about the ways in which ancient Israelites worshiped their God, it provides detailed instruction about the ways in which the Bible continues to function in American public life and even in American identity. That's what Bible movies do. Cecil B. DeMille tells us to view the Bible Exodus story as an anti-communist manifesto. Just about every epic Jesus movie portrays Jesus as a typical American champion of individual liberty over against an oppressive state, namely England or communist Russia, Soviet Union. Sheba, Bathsheba, Ruth, and Delilah project an ideal image of female beauty and glamour. Less glamorous women, such as Miriam and Abigail, are honorable, but unlikely to get their man. In some, Bible movies can provide a lens through which to glimpse the values and dynamics that have persisted and perhaps even resurged from the 1950s to the present. This can be depressing, but also important, not only for Americans, but through globalization and good marketing for the many other societies that are reached by these movies. But Bible movies are not the only lens through which contemporary America can be glimpsed, nor are they the only means to understand the role the Bible plays in American society. But to paraphrase Walt Disney, the role of film is to educate by entertaining us. We would be wise to consider exactly what we are learning at the same time as we're being entertained. Bible movies, such as the Ten Commandments, the Story of Ruth, and the King of Kings, represent what I call the Bible on film. These are movies that explicitly adapt biblical stories. They're set in the ancient past, their main heroes are biblical figures, and some, though not all of the events they recount, are based on biblical stories. But the Bible is present at the movies in another context altogether, as quotations, citations, and allusions in fictional feature films whose content is not about the Bible at all. I've called this phenomenon the Bible in film. This more fragmented use of the Bible can be seen in movies such as Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator from 1940 and Elia Kazan's East of Eden, 1955, which explicitly draw upon biblical stories and verses in their narrative structure, characterization, and dialogue. But the phenomenon increased rapidly in the latter part of the 20th century and continues unabated today. Being There, 1979, draws on Jesus' parables. Crimes and Misdemeanors, Woody Allen, 1989, recalls the Joseph saga in the book of Genesis. Independence Day, 1996, makes ample use of the book of Revelation. In Magnolia, Paul Thomas Anderson, 1999, a veritable plague of frogs afflicts a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley. Readers will be, listeners now will be relieved to know that according to the Internet Movie Database, no real frogs were hurt in the making of these films. What they used was 7,900 rubber frogs. Hollywood's Bibles often appear as on-screen props in churches and synagogues or in the hands of preachers. Think about the Coen brothers movie, A Serious Man, and Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, and many other films. As we've seen, Bible movies, that is, Bible on film, may claim to be true to the biblical text, but they often teach us more about American culture and values than about the Bible as such. By contrast, films in the Bible in film category do not set out to teach about the Bible. Rather, they use the Bible to convey their own messages. In doing so, however, they also draw attention to the themes, experiences, and emotions that lurk just beneath the surface of the biblical text. And now we'll turn to 3 movies very briefly that reflect on the creation story in Genesis 1 to 3. And here they are. First, we'll look at Terrence Malick's 2011 movie, The Tree of Life. And then we'll go back to 1998 for two comedies, Pleasantville and The Truman Show. So we begin with The Tree of Life. As we all know, I hope, Genesis 1 to 3 combines two different accounts of the creation of the world. The first chapter describes a sequence during which God creates heaven and earth, light and darkness, sky, earth, seas, vegetation, and so on. And finally, land animals and humankind. The second story, beginning in Genesis 2:14, has God creating first the earth and the heavens, then a male human, and finally the garden containing every pleasant tree with tasty fruits, rivers, and gold. Then God sought a partner for the human, creating the animals, and then out of the human side, a female person who was a viable counterpart of the male. Both of these stories are evoked in a lengthy visual sequence in Terrence Malick's masterful film, The Tree of Life. Unlike the Bible, which begins with these two creation stories, this film places its creation narrative about 30 minutes in, and it's also about 20 minutes long. So again, I can't show you the whole thing. By this point in the film, 30 minutes in, we already know that the film takes place in Texas in the 50s and 60s. That is the main narrative in the film, and that the central characters are a family, parents, and three sons. We also know about the film's central tragedy, the death of an adult son who was a soldier. The death is revealed in the early moments of the film, and we bring this knowledge into our viewing of the creation sequence. So I just want to show you a couple of short sections to give you a flavor of how Malick is treating this. The visuals are a rather literal rendition of Genesis 1:2. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the wind from God swept over the face of the waters. The words are spoken by Mrs. O'Brien, the mother of the three sons, one of whom has died. Lord, why? Where were you? The question why makes sense in light of her grief. The question, where were you, evokes Job 38:4. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? She is a person of faith, and she wonders how God could have allowed such unspeakable tragedy. In Job, however, it's God who is speaking, not a human being. And the soundtrack here, you might have caught the words, is Lacrimosa. So it's a part of the Requiem Mass, a contemporary setting from the early 2000s by a Polish composer. The second clip continues the spectacular visuals. Just see that here, shall we? So there's no musical soundtrack at this point, and we only have the brief voiceover by Mrs. O'Brien, "We Cry to You." And here she's paraphrasing Psalms, any number of Psalms, such as Psalm 142:5, in which the psalmist declares, "I cry to you, O Lord." The death of the unnamed son accounts for the lament expressed in his mother's voiceovers, but it does not suppress the joy of creation, which culminated in the birth of this same son. In contrast to the somber mood of the film as a whole, the creation sequence is a gleeful exploration of the aesthetic possibilities of CGI and animation technologies. The stunning result provides sensual pleasure for the viewer in the ways in which the shapes and colors dance together, and then resolve into clear images of trees, flowers, rivers, dinosaurs, birds, and finally, a newborn child. Malick's film is profoundly Christian, but not simplistically so. The creation sequence is not intended to uphold a biblical view of creation. Rather, the aim is to draw viewers into the experience of awe and wonder at the very existence of the world and its inhabitants, the sublime beauty of the world, and the miraculous process of conception and childbirth that brings a new person into the world, each one a new creation. In contrast to the 5 minutes or so that it takes to read the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2, the film luxuriates in each glorious step, imagining how it must have appeared, even though no one other than the Creator was there to see it. In doing so, the sequence allows us to capture through vision and sound the wonder that is lurking just beneath the words of the biblical account. The message I see in this sequence is that death does not efface or erase the life that was lived. Grief does not cancel out the joy of birth and the pleasures of the relationship one had with the one for whom we grieve. Malick's film draws us into both the drama and the beauty of the world's creation. In synchronizing the biblical account with scientific theory, the Big Bang, which we see portrayed in that sequence, it also conveys the idea that we need not believe Genesis to be true in any literal sense in order to view the world and its natural and animate beings as wondrous, perhaps even divine creations. And in the end, it affirms the integral relationship between life and death, the complexities of grief, and the persistence of memory. Now we're going to turn to Pleasantville. Numerous films allude to the second version of the creation narrative, in which God explicitly forbids the primordial humans, whom we know as Adam and Eve, to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Transgression seems inevitable, and indeed, it is confirmed by our own life in a world which has its wonders, but is far from Edenic. The transgression is described in 3:6. I won't go over this in detail. We know about the serpent. Eve is tempted. She takes the fruit and she eats it, and she gives some to her husband, and he also eats it. The serpent had told Eve that, contrary to God's warning, eating the fruit would not result in death, but rather in the opening of her eyes and in the knowledge of good and evil. And so it came to be. To say that God was pleased at their act of disobedience is an understatement. God cursed the serpent as well as human beings, promising degradation for the serpent, pain in childbirth for the woman, and toil for the man. God made them a more substantial set of clothing, of skins, and then drove them out of the garden. Immediately thereafter, the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. One film that views the disobedience of Adam and Eve and the introduction of sex into the human experience in a positive light is the 1998 comedy Pleasantville, directed by Gary Ross. The film has an absurd premise. On an evening when their mother is out, teenage siblings David and Jennifer Wagner fight over the TV remote control. David wants to watch a marathon of the 1950s sitcom Pleasantville, while Jennifer has plans to make out with a classmate, Mark Davis, while ostensibly watching the rock group Pearl Jam on MTV. As David and Jennifer fight, the remote falls and breaks, and immediately a TV repairman arrives. The teens had not called him, but they accept the remote that he offers. The repairman leaves. As soon as they press the button on the remote, however, something very strange happens. There's the remote, the new remote.
It's on the track at Indio, just driving around the block. Only new Pennzoil with text.
For program information.
Honey, I'm home. Great.
Let me see that.
No way.
There's the repairman waiting to see what happens.
Gee whiz, Mary Sue. Why can't I borrow your transistor radio? Betty Jean, she can use it over the. Do you mind? This is only the most important moment of my whole life.
Forget it, Jen. I've waited a year for this.
God, James, just give it to me.
Get it. Oh my God. I'm not sure.
So they've ended up in Pleasantville. In Pleasantville, David and Jennifer are the teenagers featured in the TV show, Bud and Mary Sue Parker. No one seems to notice the substitution, not even their TV parents, George and Betty Parker. At the same time, David and Jennifer retain their personalities. David is anxious not to disrupt Pleasantville's orderly world because he has seen each episode numerous times. He knows exactly what's going to happen, and he worries about messing with the plot. Jennifer, meanwhile, behaves exactly as she does in the real world. She immediately hooks up with the star on the basketball team and has sex with him in his car. It does not take long for other teenage couples to catch on, and for Lover's Lane to turn into a site where couples do a lot more than just hold hands. But a strange thing occurs. As these teens experience sex, they begin to see in color. And there they turn color, they acquire color, and also what they see is color. Their faces, bodies, clothing, as well as the cars in which they make out, turn from black and white into color. And the same is true of the flowers, trees, and the various objects seen by these so-called colored people. You see, so now there's a colored couple, they've had sex, another couple in the same diner, still in black and white, staring at them. It's not long before the normal, that is the black and white citizens of the town, are up in arms, and signs forbidding coloreds begin to appear in front of some of the stores. And a group of stalwart men, town leaders and businessmen, call for expelling the coloreds from Pleasantville. It turns out, however, that not only sex, but any strong emotion can color a person. Realizing this, David/Bud angers the town mayor, who's the one who's spearheading all of these measures. He angers him to such a degree that he too acquires color. Along with knowledge of sex comes curiosity, an emotion curiously absent from Pleasantville's TV world. The people of Pleasantville have never experienced rain. They never read, all the books are blank. They know nothing of the world outside Pleasantville. Indeed, they're not aware that there is a world out there. After Mary Sue has disrupted Pleasantville's pleasant life, Bud realizes that he was wrong. Their role in Pleasantville was precisely to mess up the town's neat and orderly life. David and Jen can ensure that Pleasantville does not remain stuck in a black and white 1950s world, but that it can move forward with the risk and joy that are woven into the fabric of real life. As it turns out, in their real lives, Jennifer had been the rebellious and precocious one. David, on the other hand, was nerdy, shy, and completely inexperienced with dating. In Pleasantville, however, he attracts the attention of the lively and lovely Margaret. And here's what happens one night as they are sitting outside near Lover's Lane.
Want some berries?
Huh?
Some berries, I picked them myself.
Really?
Yeah, there's lots of stuff.
Like what?
Here, I'll show you.
There we go.
Here. Go ahead, try it.
Go ahead, try it. As it turns out, the TV repairman is able to watch David and Jennifer's adventures in Pleasantville, and they in turn can see him on TV. He is none too pleased when Margaret offers the apple to Bud.
What the hell do you think you're doing? Get in here, now! Think this is a toy? You think it's your own little goddamn coloring book?
Look, it just sort of happened.
Yeah, you doesn't just happen. Bolts of lightning don't just happen.
I didn't do anything wrong.
Oh, no? Let me show you something.
Go on, try it.
Boom! Right there! What do you call that, huh? You know, you don't deserve this place. You don't deserve to live in this paradise. Where's the remote control I gave you?
Why?
Because you're coming home, you little twerp, and I'm gonna put this place back the way it was.
I can't let you do that.
What?
I'm sorry, I'm not gonna let you do that.
Just give me the damn remote!
I'm gonna go now.
You're not going anywhere. You're gonna get that remote and you're gonna come home and we're gonna make everybody happy again. Hey.
In the end, David does return to the so-called real world to find out that he's been gone only 1 hour. Jennifer, however, remains in Pleasantville, where she has acquired the joy of learning. She has applied and been accepted to college, an opportunity that she never would have had in her previous life. And now we turn finally to The Truman Show, which has been described as an American psychological science fiction satirical comedy drama film, which just about covers all the genres. Like Pleasantville, which came out the same year, this film's allusions to Genesis focus on the second version of the creation narrative, in which God explicitly forbids the humans to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I think we're getting, probably should start wrapping up. So I'm just going to go quickly over the next piece of explanation of the Genesis story, which you really don't need. But I just wanted to point out that some people have interpreted the Genesis story as a parable for human development. And that's what I want to point out, because that's what we see also in the film, The Truman Show. The experiences of the man and woman in the garden mirror the process of human development from infancy to maturity. As they grow into puberty and adulthood, they discover sexuality, engage in sexual activity, produce offspring, toil for the sustenance, and eventually die. But there's also expressed in the Bible and in numerous works of literature the desire to return to an earlier, less troubled time. And we saw that also in the words of the TV repairman in that last clip that I showed you from Pleasantville. And just there are a number of biblical passages. I'm not going to go through these. And we also find, of course, in literature, John Milton, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained. And now we turn to the Truman Show. The Truman Show uses Genesis imagery to challenge this longing for a return to Eden. The film is about a television show, also called The Truman Show. So in that sense, it's also similar to Pleasantville, of course. The unwitting star of the show is a man called Truman Burbank, who, without realizing it, was born and lived his entire life on live TV. The show, The Truman Show, broadcasts every detail of Truman's life 24/7, and it has a large international following. So this is a reality show that basically has people following minute by minute the life of this man, Truman. Truman doesn't know about all of this. He's oblivious to his own stardom. The corporation that funds the show had adopted him shortly after he was born to an unmarried woman. The director of the show is called Christoph, and Christoph has engineered Truman's entire life story. The people whom Truman knows as his parents, his wife, his friends, his business associates, and everyone else, these are all actors. Sea Haven, the island town where Truman lives, is an elaborate stage set covered by a dome into which thousands of lights are set. And the action there is controlled by Christoph, who apparently lives and works inside an artificial moon that hangs in the sky above Sea Haven. Truman's life becomes unsettled when at the age of 30, he's nearly hit by a large lamp, ostensibly a star, falling from the sky. And he begins to notice other anomalies as well and to suspect that something very strange is going on. He has always longed to leave Sea Haven to explore the world, but he's been prevented by one thing or another. He doesn't know, but the audience knows, that every event in his life has been orchestrated by Christoph. The biggest impediment to Truman's plans is his tremendous fear of water, a symptom of the PTSD he suffered when, as a young child, he apparently witnessed his father's death by drowning. In the end, however, his determination to leave, fueled by the growing awareness of his artificial environment, prompts him to overcome his fears. He stages an elaborate escape, learns the truth, and leaves. Truman's hometown, Sea Haven, is the Eden that everyone apparently longs for. And as you see here in this slide, the connection is signaled by the town's very name, Sea Haven, which is an anagram, if not quite a perfect one, of the word heavens. Every day is sunny, everyone is always cheerful, the town is always perfectly clean. The island is a true paradise. And here we have his coworker showing him this headline, "The best place on earth." There's no poverty, no homelessness, no hunger. When bad things happen, it is for a reason. I'm just going to show this.
Maybe I'm being set up for something. You ever think about that, Marlon? Like your whole life has been building towards something? No. When you were hauling chickens in the summer for Kaiser, what was the furthest you ever got off the island? Went all over. Never found a place like this, though. Look at that sunset, Truman. It's perfect. Yeah. That's the big guy. Quite a paintbrush he's got. Yeah.
So here Truman is confessing his uncertainty to his best friend, who is an actor, whose main job it is to reassure Truman that there's no better place on Earth. And as Truman drives to work, the morning radio host jovially proclaims that it's another beautiful day in paradise. And finally, I just want to show this scene, which is when they're looking.
Maybe I'm being set up for something.
In this clip, Truman has escaped and everybody's looking for him. You'll see a famous line here. That's Christoph.
Policy.
Wait, do I do that?
Heal the son. What's going on?
Cue the sun. Let there be light. There you go. The parallels between Eden and Sea Haven, Genesis and the Truman Show, are by no means subtle. Both Genesis and the Truman Show feature a creator who's larger than life, or believes that he is, in the case of Christoph. A man who is either literally, Adam, or socially, Truman, created for the purposes of living in a perfect world. In both cases, the man rebels against the creator. Adam eats the fruit, and Truman escapes Christoph's control. As in the book of Genesis, the sojourn in Eden doesn't last forever. In both stories, the human's departure is an act of disobedience. In important ways, however, the Truman Show reverses both the narrative and the emotional tenor of Genesis. Whereas Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden by God after disobeying God, Truman's departure from Sea Haven is an escape that itself constitutes disobedience to his creator. In leaving Eden, Adam does not escape God's purview. In leaving Sea Haven, however, Truman escapes the control of Christoph, who may be the Sea Haven's creator, but he is not God. Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden is meant to be read as a regrettable development for which they themselves are to blame. Truman's escape, on the other hand, is a victory, cheered on by the millions of people who have followed his growth from infancy to adulthood. And like Adam and Eve, Truman's departure is precipitated by newfound knowledge that allows his transformation from an overgrown teenager into a mature adult. And we see this in the escapes in comparing how he's dressed both before and after. So before, he is dressed like a child. He wears shorts, he wears kind of mismatched clothes. And then as he is escaping, here we see he's dressed like a normal adult man. In drawing so abundantly on Genesis imagery, the Truman Show, the movie, can prod us to question whether returning to Eden is truly as desirable as Western biblical, theological, and cultural heritage might suggest. To be sure, in our own troubled times, the idea of returning to a place in which people lived in harmony with one another and with the natural world has a real appeal. We might all want to turn back the clock before the pandemic and before climate change. On the other hand, to return to an Eden-like existence might be as stultifying and ultimately unsatisfactory as Sea Haven was for Truman. Human thriving, suggests the film, requires some rainy days, challenges, disappointments, as well as achievements. This, however, presumes a white, privileged, and economically prosperous existence of the sort that is represented in the film itself. Presumably, Truman did not experience hunger, homelessness, or abuse once he left the island. To conclude very briefly, viewers often expect movies that dramatize the Bible to be faithful to the biblical story. This can lead both to disappointment with the liberties that Hollywood takes, and also to a wealth of disinformation or misinformation, as we've just seen. Viewers do not have any such expectations of fictional films that allude to or quote the Bible. And yet such films can provide a more profound knowledge, not of the Bible's content as such, but of its potential meanings for our own lives. This is because these movies situate their biblical references in the context of human experiences to which we can all relate. Unlike Bible movies, they don't implicitly require the viewer to take on the Christian perspective that is portrayed or hinted at on the screen. Instead, they use the Bible to signal the deeper meaning of the fictional experiences they portray, and to help viewers relate to and see themselves within those experiences. Rather than adapting biblical books for the silver screen, they're drawing from the Bible as one resource among many to portray their own stories. Yet even in these films, Disney's adage holds true. Fictional films are not didactic, as many Bible movies are, but they still teach us even as they entertain us. What they teach us is that the Bible is more than a set of foundational stories and more than a source of piety and faith. The Bible can also be a resource, a lens, if you like, for understanding ourselves and the people around us. Thank you very much.
We now welcome Richard for his response.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here. I'm always pleased to see Adele, to talk to Adele. She's written some very important books about Bible and film. She wrote one of the first books I ever read on Bible and film. It's called Scripture on the Silver Screen. She's still using some of those themes today, which she developed in a more recent book, Bible and Cinema. Both of these books are highly recommended and have a lot to teach us about film and about the Bible. As I understand Adele's remarks tonight, she was interested in telling us what we can learn about the Bible from film. I've jotted some notes as she was speaking, and I agree with virtually everything she said about what film teaches us about the Bible. First, she said that film teaches us that the biblical story has certain gaps that people like to fill in. She even suggested that people fill them in from church tradition, theology, art, and so forth. I think we could ask, if we were doing a more specific analysis of a specific film, we could ask who fills in these stories, who should fill in the stories, who do we listen to, and from whence do we get the material we use to fill in these stories. I think a lot of it has to do in that regard, not only with biblical tradition, with church worship, church tradition, but it also has to do with the way movies are made, the way movies get told in particular cultures like Hollywood, with motifs that you see over and over again. And also, I think that we could push Adele's point here just a little bit farther to talk about the fact that what these movies may teach us is the importance of storytelling. I think that's where Adele is going at the end in her conclusion, when she's talking about how the Bible can help us understand human experience and understand other people as well. I think it's also where she's going when she talks about a second thing that film can teach us about the Bible, and that is something about the persistent questions that the Bible offers. People used to call these existential questions or big questions. She talked about theodicy. She could have talked about many other things. She does say, however, that she doesn't think that film ever teaches us anything unique about the Bible. She says we can learn everything that film has to say about the Bible somewhere else in some theological tradition. And that's probably true to a certain extent. On the other hand, I don't know always when people learn what they learn. I don't know if I want to go so far as to say that film can never teach us anything about the Bible. I think film has taught me some things about the Bible. For one thing, film has taught me about the relevance of the Bible in ways that I didn't expect the Bible to be relevant. Pasolini taught me things about the message of Jesus that I had never imagined. Scorsese taught me things about religious questions that I had not yet understood. And I'm sure those things are there somewhere else in all of the traditions, or they wouldn't resonate so much with us. But film might have what is a unique insight for an individual. And they probably say something about how Bible and life get interpreted in particular moments and cultures. Adele does a very good job in tracing how films change historically and how readings of films change historically. And so we could also be talking about that film might be teaching us how we change our reading of the Bible, or we change our understanding of major questions as time goes on. The third thing Adele says about what the Bible can teach us is I think the most important thing that she's taught me about Bible film is it positions biblical characters as if they are white, male, heterosexual, Christian Americans. And I think that's undeniable when you look at the history of at least American film, US film. But that's something that I don't think I had tried to come to grips with until people like Adele started talking about this, until we had in the last 20, 30 years, people talking about the fact that, well, in the last maybe 60 years, we've come more and more to an understanding of Jesus the Jew. We've come more and more to an understanding that biblical characters don't look like old white guys. And I think this is an important thing to keep considering, to keep remembering. And she goes on tonight to say, not only is the Bible a Christian book in film, it also tends to be a conservative Christian book, a Protestant book, probably, with apologies to Scorsese, Dennis Arcand, some other people, Pasolini, Rossellini. But I think it is. I think many people have commented upon the fact that film has become more apocalyptic in the last years, and that the people who watch religious film seem to be being packaged as someone who appreciate a rightist perspective, a conservative perspective. When Gibson's film was made, everybody thought this was a big deal and that it was going to change how film was made. And the people who talked about this said, well, we're going to see a lot more biblical epics after this. And we did see some biblical epics like Aronofsky's Noah and Ridley Scott's Exodus film. But what we also learned was that Gibson was far more successful, at least popularly, than Aronofsky, and more successful than Scott. And when you look at the films, Gibson has less questions about biblical material. He has more faith in what he's presenting as if it is the Bible, while both Aronofsky and Scott are puzzled and confused about some things. And that hasn't sold as well, at least in the United States, in recent years. Certainty has sold better. Matt Page, in an interesting essay about Bible film in Italy, says that in the last 20, 30 years, Italian biblical film has become more and more subversive, more and more critical, more challenging, has a lot more questions to ask about religion, about the Bible, about what human existence is. And he also says, in sort of in passing, that US film has become less critical and much more religiously conservative, much more certain about what the message and the meaning of biblical texts are. I think that's worth thinking about. So after she made these very important observations, she went on to talk about something that she has developed in great detail in her most recent film book, the Bible and Cinema book. She talks about Bible in film, Bible on film and Bible and film, because she's trying to help us package what we see in film in terms of what we know about the Bible. And so Bible on film it's like a Jesus film, and Bible in film is something more like a Christ figure film, if I can simplify things. And she's on to something that all of us want to talk about, and I don't really know how to do it. My categories get fuzzy really quickly. Cheryl Exum, years and years ago, in an early Semia volume, one of the first people to start talking seriously about film in biblical terms, tried to package that entire volume of disparate books by talking about Bible in film and Bible and film. And if I understand Adele, and if I understood Cheryl Exum's piece, what Adele means by Bible on film, Cheryl meant Bible in film, and what Adele means by Bible in film, Cheryl meant Bible and film. Both of them are trying to talk about the fact that sometimes what you see is something that you can readily identify as something biblical, and other times what you see is something that has a more tangential relationship to Bible and film. A lady named Sanders wrote a book about literary appropriations of earlier text once and tried to make a similar distinction by talking about adaptation and appropriation. You can find much more complicated treatments. Gerard Genette's palimpsest, Anthony Swindle has talked about modern literature in terms of the Bible in light of Genette's palimpsests, and there must be 37 categories in Genette and in Swindle's attempts to talk about how biblical material get repackaged. So I don't want to quibble over the categories. I agree with Adele that sometimes it's pretty clear that the Bible's in film as an object or as a quotation or as a story or a character, and other times we think that there's some kind of connection with the Bible and film, and I'm willing to be open to less certain connections perhaps than Adele is. So I might say that. I'd also like to say that we might also consider another category, whatever we name these things, on film and in film, and also consider another category that Matt Renge has talked about a lot lately, and that is film as Bible. So Matt's not so interested about the biblical elements in film or whether the questions that both Bible and film might be trying to deal with, or the answers they might be trying to give. What Matt wants to talk about is the fact that sometimes film functions in a way similar to biblical texts. I don't remember all of the categories that Matt uses, but he talks about biblical lament, and then says that certain films seem to have the same kind of function for people that biblical lament does. He talks about film having kind of mythic quality, and he's using myth in the sense that comparative religion scholars use myth as the foundational story or as the identifying story of a particular culture. I think that's what Adele is talking about a lot in her most recent book when she talks about the American quality of many U.S. biblical films, that of the way that they try to provide an identity for U.S. people in particular at certain moments. I think that's what she's after when she talks about the Bible being white and heteronormative and patriarchal and all these other things. Matt also talks about the possibility of film functioning as parable. And these, I think, are harder to find. And when Matt's talking about parable, he's using parable as a kind of opposite of myth. He's using parable as something which does not provide an identity or a common sense, but raises questions about that common sense or that identity, perhaps like a Buddhist koan. He's after rethinking things, rethinking the questions we want to ask when he talks about parable, in the way that some people read Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, or Jesus' parable of the two sons. Sometimes we call it the prodigal son, and how they get us to rethink pretty basic relationships, easy assumptions that we have made about who is friend or who is enemy, or who deserves what, this kind of thing. Now, I guess I'd also like at this point to add yet one more thing, which is a little bit like Adele's Bible as talisman notion she developed in her very first book on Bible and film that I'm aware of. Steve Wiggins has recently written a book about the use of the Bible in horror film, which he called Holy Horror. And he said a couple of things about the Bible of horror and the Bible of U.S. popular culture. He said that the Bible in such film is a magical book. Sometimes it's not, the magic isn't powerful enough and it fails, and people, but it conveys power. I remember Adele talking about this once with the Apostle, and talking about how the Bible was for the Duvall character in The Apostle, something that conferred holiness and sacredness. It turned a wrecked car into a church where he could share the message of Jesus with someone and try to save them. Wiggins is talking about something like this. He's talking about the way that film uses the Bible as a weapon, as a talisman, to ward off vampires, or to reveal secret material, but it's also about how the Bible, how film uses the Bible or other ancient books as something that ought to be left alone, because you never know what's going to happen when you open some old book. Wiggins also talks about this Bible, the Bible of film, as being a prophetic book, as a book that is not only in some sense providential, but in a sense has something to say about the future. So one last thing. So Adele talks about what we can learn from the film. I've tried to indicate what I understood her to say in that regard, and to make some suggestions about perhaps some additional things in that regard. Talks about her categories of Bible on film, Bible in film. We could talk about her interpretations of the three films that she's looked at here. I like her interpretations of these films. But I think a thing that we could learn from Bible and film is simply the importance of interpretation. That the Bible is not there simply to be, that it must be appropriated, adapted, it must be used, it must be taken up or simply left alone. And so you could go back and look at each of the films that Adele has looked at, and you could slightly twist her interpretation or move it in another direction. Instead of talking about the tree of life, and the Genesis story, which she's trying to talk about all of her films in terms of the Genesis material, of course, but you could move more towards Job. If you move more towards Job, Tree of Life might not be such a life-affirming movie as it is when it's read in terms of the wonder of creation. With Pleasantville and the Eden story, she's read this as the importance of coming age. She does that too with the third film, with Bible helping us grow up in a certain sense. But you could read Pleasantville more theologically. You could read Pleasantville as an indictment of the God of the creation stories. You could, or the Garden of Eden story at least, and you could read this as a sense that maybe you can read the story more comically, rather than more mythically or horribly or providentially. And the same with the Truman material. Once again, she reads this very well as a coming of age story, and the sense that maybe the Bible is urging us to take responsibility for our life. But you could also read the Truman Show film as a more Nietzschean piece, as something which is advocating the abandonment of God, or the abandonment of traditions, or the abandonment of the past. You could do these things. So I think the thing that I have most learned from Adele's work on Bible and film, and from her lecture tonight, and from working with Bible and film myself, is that when you start talking about film and Bible, the question of interpretation becomes incredibly important. We need to think about who's interpreting, why they're interpreting, what their agenda might be. Now, we talk about this regularly with text in terms of their authors. We talk about this regularly in film in terms of the filmmaker. But there is also a response, which is either a worshipful response or a popular response, or it can be an academic and critical response. So I would like to, I'd like to call a little bit of interpretation, a little bit more attention to learning simply about the ubiquity of interpretation when you start considering Bible and film. But I'd also like to stop by thanking Adele for this presentation, for all the work she's done over the years with Bible and film, and thanking you also for allowing me to respond to Adele this evening.